I call the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. By tradition, at the beginning of each parliamentary session, we commemorate the members we've lost in the last year. Sadly, Mr Speaker, this year must also mark the passing of those we've lost in horrific events in recent days and weeks. The fire at Grenfell Tower in West London has killed at least 79 people. What makes it both a tragedy and an outrage is that every single one of those deaths could have been avoided. Something has gone horrifically wrong. The North Kensington community are demanding answers, and they're entitled to those answers. Thousands of people living in tower blocks around the country need urgent reassurance, and the emergency services, especially fire and rescue services in this case, deserve our deepest respect and support. I also want to pay a very warm tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Kensington, who in recent days has demonstrated so clearly why her local community put their faith in her determination to ensure that every family is rehoused locally is an exemplary work of a dedicated Member of Parliament. And I think we welcome her to this House. Lessons must be learned, Mr Speaker, in the public inquiry, and a disaster that never should have happened must never happen again. The terrorist attacks in Manchester, London Bridge and Finsbury Park took innocent lives, causing dozens of injuries and traumatised hundreds of people, with willful and callous disregard for human life. The attack in the early hours of Monday morning in my own constituency is a reminder to us all that hate has no creed, that violence has no religion, and that we must stand up to hatred, whoever the target, and stand together against those who would drive us apart. And last night, hundreds of people assembled alongside Finsbury Park Mosque to give just that message from all communities and all faiths. Our communities and our country are strongest when we're united. As our late colleague Joe Cox said, we have far more in common than that which divides us. It's just over a year ago that Joe was taken from us by someone driven by hatred. Joe was driven by love and by an infectious energy. It was in the spirit of that energy and passion for people, life and justice that so many events were held in her memory around the country last weekend, including one in Muslim Welfare House in my constituency, near the site of the vile attack that happened a day later. They held a great get-together at the weekend. We should remember her and thank her, and make sure these great get-together events do continue year in, year out, to unite our local communities. Earlier this year, Mr Speaker, we also lost the Father of the House, Sir Gerald Corbyn, who had served his constituents for nearly 47 years and previously worked for Harold Wilson in Downing Street. Gerald was an iconic and irascible figure in the Labour Party. He came from a proud Jewish background and campaigned to bring peace to the Middle East throughout his life. And it was my pleasure to travel with him in that quest to many countries in the region. And I loved the very many lengthy conversations we had with him. In fact, nobody ever had a short conversation with Sir Gerald. Both Gerald and Joe will be fondly remembered by all who knew them and worked with them. Mr Speaker, I want to congratulate the mover and seconder of the Queen's speech. First, I do congratulate the Honourable Member for Newbury on his speech. My mother told me of the joy of Greenham Common because she was there, and I went to visit her there, and I hope that he will understand the deep love of humanity that motivated all those women and others to go to Greenham Common during those days. And I would like to thank him for taking time out from his considerable responsibilities, looking after his extensive property portfolio and tending to his directorship of the UK Water Partnership. I hope one day a Labour government may soon be able to come to the aid of his Newbury constituents by taking water back into public ownership and to the aid of his tenants by ensuring there's a responsibility on landlords to ensure all homes are fit for human habitation. I know the honourable member will also continue diligently to pursue his other interests in Parliament, his interests in defence, in Africa and in rural affairs, and I do agree with part of what he said, where he spoke up of the need for us as a country to adhere to all the agreements on climate change issues all around the world, and I thank him for that part of his speech. I turn now to the seconder of today's loyal address, the Honourable Member for Spelthorne, whose speech was typically articulate and very erudite. After all, he is a former winner of University Challenge, so he would be able to do that. He mentioned Benjamin Disraeli, and I welcome that because Benjamin Disraeli once said, "If I want to read a book, I write one." Well, Mr. Speaker, it seems the honourable gentleman has taken the maxim to new levels, writing or co-writing 6 books during the 7 years he's been a member of this House. And I've been looking through the back catalogue of his books, and one book absolutely stands out. It's a must-read. It's absolutely apposite to our times. I hope it's reprinted. It came out in 2011, and the book said, "After the Coalition." Now, I don't want to cut across any of his present literary representations, but perhaps a sequel may be in the offing. Although I understand the latest coalition may already be in some chaos. And nothing could emphasise that chaos more than the Queen's speech we've just heard. A threadbare legislative programme from a government that's lost its majority and apparently run out of ideas altogether. This would be a thin legislative programme even if it was for 1 year. But for 2 years? 2 years? There's not enough in it to fill up 1 year. Mr. Speaker, it's therefore appropriate to start by welcoming what's not in the speech. Firstly, there's no mention of scrapping the winter fuel allowance for millions of pensioners through means testing. Can the Prime Minister assure us the Conservative plan has now been withdrawn? Mercifully, neither is there any mention of ditching the triple lock. Pensioners across Britain will also be grateful to know whether the Tory election commitment on that has also been binned. And older people and their families might also be keen for some clarity around the government's policy on social care. Whether it's still what was originally set out in the Conservative manifesto, or whether it's what was later amended to, or whether it is now something else entirely. And I'm sure it's just a matter of historical record, but looking on a Conservative website today, the manifesto has been taken down in its entirety. It apparently no longer exists. The Prime Minister might also like to confirm that food is not, after all, going to be taken from the mouths of infants, and that younger primary school children will continue to receive universal free school meals. On the subject of schools, Mr. Speaker, there was nothing about grammar schools in the gracious speech. Does the Prime Minister now agree with her predecessor that it is delusional to think that a policy of expanding the number of grammar schools is either a good idea, a sellable idea, or even a right idea? Mr. Speaker, the good news may even extend to our furry friends. If the Prime Minister can guarantee the barbaric practice of fox hunting will remain banned in this country. Mr. Speaker, the government has recently embarked on what are likely to be very difficult negotiations concerning Brexit, which the whole House will want to scrutinise. Unfortunately, there have been some leaks, with the other side in the process expressing dismay at the weakness of the government's negotiating skills. But that's enough about coalitions of chaos with the Democratic Unionist Party. We must get on to the even more crucial issue of Brexit. Labour accepted from the beginning that the decision of the referendum has been taken. We are leaving the European Union. The question is how and on what terms. The government could have begun negotiations on a far better footing had ministers accepted the will of the House in July last year and granted full rights to European Union nationals living in this country. I hope now that the minority government will indeed listen to the wisdom of this House a bit more and work in partnership with our European neighbours. It is... of course.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. During the election campaign, he repeatedly refused to rule out a second referendum on our EU membership. Given that Brexit negotiations have now commenced, will he take this opportunity to rule out a second referendum now?
I'm not sure the honourable member was listening very carefully to any of my many speeches in the general election campaign. I made it clear we would negotiate sensibly and fairly with the European Union and bring the results of those negotiations back to this House. It's in all our interests we get a Brexit deal that puts jobs and the economy first. No deal is not better than a bad deal. It's a bad deal and not viable for this country. We need full access to the single market and a customs arrangement that provide Britain, as the Brexit Secretary has pledged, and I quote, with the exact same benefits as now. Neither must arbitrary targets for immigration be prioritised over the jobs and living standards of the people of this country. Let's decide our immigration policy on the basis of the needs of our communities and our economy, not to the tune of dog whistle cynicism of Linton Crosby or the hate campaigns, or indeed, Mr. Speaker, the hate campaigns of some sections of our press whose idea of patriotism is to base themselves in an overseas tax haven.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. I would like to ask, can he confirm the contradiction in his own plans, that where he plans not to reduce immigration numbers, yet also stopping employers recruiting overseas? Is it not the right honourable gentleman that is a bit wobbly?
Mr. Speaker, we made it very clear throughout the election campaign and before that those employers that unscrupulously recruit low-paid workers from overseas, exploit them in this country and run away with the profits at the same time as creating community discord are wrong, are making money out of poverty and are grossly exploiting very vulnerable people on both sides of the Channel.
For giving way. The Tory position on the single market and the customs union is clear. They were out of both. What is the Labour position on the single market and the customs union?
Again, Mr. Speaker, our position has been absolutely clear. Our position is we need tariff-free access to the European market to protect industries and jobs in this country. And let's have a little bit less from the other side of the dangerous threats of turning Britain itself into a tax haven, which would threaten jobs and public services here far more than in mainland Europe. We do not yet know the official title of the government's much-trumpeted Great Repeal Bill. But if we're talking about taking back control, then Parliament must be able to scrutinise legislation. Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, the thin gruel of this gracious speech allows plenty of time for longer debates and greater scrutiny. That must include ensuring that the Human Rights Act and our commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights and the human rights of everyone in this country remain completely and totally intact, and we will ensure they do. It's our determination that by working with devolved administrations, responsibilities such as agriculture and fisheries will be devolved to those administrations and not hoarded in Whitehall. And on the subject of devolved administrations, may I also wish the Prime Minister every success in reconvening talks with all parties to restore the Stormont Assembly in Belfast as soon as possible. We also very much hope that any done deal with the DUP in this place respects the overriding priority of the Good Friday Agreement to maintain peace in Northern Ireland. Mr. Speaker, a state visit from the Spanish head of state was announced for July, but can the Prime Minister update the House on whether she can still expect the United States head of state to visit any time this year or any time in the future? Just a question. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, public service workers, such as fire service, police and NHS staff, receive huge praise when they respond to terrorist attacks and other major incidents. But it's not good enough to be grateful to our public service workers only at a moment of crisis and disaster. They deserve dignity, the dignity of fully funded services, the dignity of not seeing their jobs cut and living standards fall. There are now 20,000 fewer police officers than when the Conservatives came into office in 2010. And when the police, and Mr. Speaker, when the police raised this subject with the then Home Secretary, do you know what? She accused the police officers of crying wolf. I hope the current Prime Minister will correct the mistakes of the former Home Secretary. The gracious speech promises them all the powers they need, but what the police and security services deserve and the public demand is that they will have all the resources that they need.
Order. It is manifestly clear that at the moment the Leader of the Opposition is not giving way. Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Because what was briefed to the media yesterday about scrapping the changes to the police funding formula is insufficient.
Yes, it is.
As they will only move funding between the member for Chester is very prescient and very forward-sighting. Thank you very much. As it will only move funding between rural and urban forces, when the real issue, Mr. Speaker, is the £2.3 billion cut that has been made in police budgets in the past 5 years. Mr. Speaker, our firefighters did an outstanding job at the Grenfell Tower fire. But those firefighters worked incredibly long shifts, in part because there are 600 fewer firefighters in London, 10 fewer fire stations in London, cuts and closures forced through by the previous Mayor of London. And talking to those firefighters, Mr. Speaker, exhausted from their work, who went into a burning building to save people, I said, why do you do it? Why do you go in when you know it's so difficult and so dangerous? They said, because we're firefighters, that's what we're trained to do, that's why we serve the public the way we do. We need more of them, there needs to be greater security for all of them in the future. We have to properly fund our fire services, not just at a time of crisis. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the fact that there's a public inquiry going on into Grenfell. But can we take action now? And I pay tribute to those councils, including Croydon Council, for its commitment this week to install sprinklers in all tower blocks of 10 storeys or more. But such minimal fire safety standards cannot be left to a postcode lottery. So will the government make available emergency funds for councils to both check cladding and to install sprinklers? The government should also have committed to a public safety bill to implement the recommendations of the 2013 inquiry into the fire at Lakanal House and reverse its guidance that removed the requirement to install sprinklers in new school buildings. It could still do so, and it would do so with our support, additional to any other recommendations that come from the Grenfell Tower inquiry. Yes, of course.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way and what he said about sprinkler systems for high-rise flats. We have 116 blocks of high-rise flats in my city of Leeds, 26 of which are in my constituency. At the moment, only 8, and those are the sheltered accommodations, will have sprinklers. It will cost £30 million for sprinklers in all of those flats. Will the right honourable gentleman join with me in urging the government to provide the money for all local authorities to put sprinklers into those high-rises?
I absolutely thank my friend for that intervention, and indeed during the discussion we held last week in Westminster Hall about this, her friend, the member for Leeds Central, raised a very similar point about the numbers of tower blocks. And I don't suppose too many members of this House live in tower blocks, but just think for a moment of the sense of fear that so many people had when they saw that Lacknell House fire. They're living on the 15th, 16th, 17th floor, knowing there's no fire ladder that can reach them, no helicopter that can land, and they're reliant on being able to get out or the fire to be contained. We need to give everyone that assurance, and local authorities that have seen massive cuts in their budget over the past years need the resources now to install the necessary sprinkler systems and fire prevention systems. And you cannot just use the excuse that the money isn't there. The money has got to be there to ensure we save life in the future. And we will support the government if it is able to bring that forward. Could I, well, for the last time I'll give way, then I must move on. Yes.
Go on, Andy. Could I, on behalf of my honourable friend for Kensington, Westminster North, well as myself, thank him for visiting the area and also for making this an absolute priority. Right. Will he ensure that he and the government ensure that both the disaster relief in North Kensington and also pursuing this issue over the safety of people in tower blocks is made the absolute #1 priority? That's right, Andy.
I thank my friend. Thank him for the support he's given to my friend the member for Kensington in the work that's been done there. Because what's happened in Grenfell Tower is terrifying for all those there. And I have to say, the problems that have ensued since then indicate just what happens when you cut local authorities' spending to the bone, and local authorities cannot cope as a result. We need properly funded, good quality public services in this country. The Prime Minister says that legal support will be made available to the families affected by the Grenfell Tower fire. But they should have had access to legal aid beforehand. And when they were raising their desperate concerns about fire safety, they were ignored, and again ignored by a Conservative-controlled local authority. The lessons of the failed austerity programme must urgently be learned. We cannot have council housing, social housing on the cheap, and we cannot have public services on the cheap. We have to invest in them. So will the Prime Minister now halt the cuts to the police, cuts that the former Met Commissioner this week called an absurdity? Those cuts have affected our prisons too, Mr. Speaker. Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons has expressed his concern at the lack of prisons and a courts reform bill, one that could have implemented our election manifesto to employ another 3,000 prison officers. Our children's schools are facing budget cuts. Can the Prime Minister confirm whether cuts per pupil funding are going ahead? And can she clarify to the House the status of the national funding formula? Head teachers and teachers are going through incredible stress with oversized classes and the difficulties of maintaining employment of teachers. The gracious speech mentioned legislation to protect victims of domestic violence. But does that also include restoring legal aid in such cases, or restoring the funding to reopen the many refuges that have been closed? We welcome reform of mental health legislation to give it greater priority. And we would welcome an assurance that no mental health trust will see its budget cut this year, like 40% of them did last year. Will she call on the public service pay? Will she call time on the public sector pay cap, which means our nurses are 14% worse off today than they were 7 years ago? As the Prime Minister is aware, some nurses and other public service workers have been forced to resort to using food banks, alongside over 1 million other people in this country. Rising inflation, the effects of low pay, falling real incomes are going to hit even more families. The 6 million workers earning less than the living wage, the millions of people in insecure work, those subject to benefits freeze, and the 5.5 million public servants. We owe them a lot better deal than they've been given by this government in the past 7 years. My party, Labour, won almost 13 million votes at the election, Mr. Speaker. And that was because, Mr. Speaker, we offered hope and opportunity for all and a real change to our country. The Prime Minister began the election campaign. She began the election campaign saying, if I lose just 6 seats, I will lose this election. When it came to it, she lost more than 4 times that many seats to Labour alone. From Cardiff to Canterbury, from Stockton to Kensington, people chose hope over fear. And they sent an unequivocal message, Mr. Speaker, that austerity must be brought to an end. 7 years of Conservative rule has left wages falling, inflation rising, the pound falling, personal debt rising, and the economy slowing. By no stretch of the imagination could any of that be described as strong or stable. I've given way to 3 members on that side and 3 members on this side, so I will conclude my speech. Thank you. If you want to boost pay, the most effective means is through strong and independent trade unions. Workers collectively defending and improving their pay and conditions. So we would repeal the Trade Union Act and strengthen collective bargaining. Across Britain, people have shown they believe there is a better way. In recent years, this government has thrown away tens of billions of pounds in tax giveaways to the very richest and to big business. And at the very same time, closing Sure Start centres, closing libraries, tipping social care into crisis and our National Health Service into record deficit. Under Conservative rule, school budgets have been cut, college courses closed, students being saddled with a lifetime of debt, and per-patient funding in the NHS set to fall for the first time in history. Our manifesto, for the many, not the few, and its popular policies, set out a very different path, which caught the imagination of millions. A way for the public really to take back control, so that our key utilities and our railways are taken into public ownership and run in the interests of the many, not to pay the dividends of the few. We would end austerity, Mr. Speaker, by making very different choices. By asking the highest 5% of earners to pay a little bit more, while still keeping the top 10 percentage points lower than it was for most of Margaret Thatcher's time in office. By asking big business to pay a little more in tax, while still retaining a lower corporation tax rate than any other G7 country. Austerity and inequality are choices. They're not necessities. They are not unfortunate outcomes. They are a choice. They are a choice to make life worse for the many, to maintain the privilege of a few. If this government rejects austerity, challenges inequality, invests to expand and rebalance our economy, then it would have our support. But it continues down this path of deliberately making people worse off, of deepening division, and of neglecting communities that deserve support and respect. Then we will oppose them every step of the way if they continue with that. Mr. Speaker, This is a government. I will continue with my speech. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a government without a majority, without a mandate, without a serious legislative programme, led by a Prime Minister who's lost her political authority and is struggling even today to stitch together a deal to stay in office.
Yes. Point of order, Mrs. Miller. I hope it is a point of order. To prejudge it. Let's hear the attempted point of order. Point of order, Mrs. Maria Miller.
Mr. Speaker, I'm simply seeking your advice as somebody who's been in this House for 12 years, that members on this side can be somewhat disappointed that the Leader of the Opposition is not in a position to be able to answer our questions. Perhaps he can advise on what the usual format is in these cases.
All I will say to the Right Honourable Lady is this. I'm much touched by her faith in my abilities or her assessment of the extent of my powers. Disappointment may be very regrettable, but it is not a matter for the chair. Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Speaker, I am deeply sorry that the member...
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to that point of order, the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, said about 10 minutes ago in conclusion, I fear as time has passed, he may be in danger of inadvertently having misled the House. And I thought you might want to take the opportunity to set this right.
Now, some people may think that the Honourable Gentleman is fastidious and others may conclude that he's pedantic. You pay your money and you take your choice. But there is no disorder here, although if people persist in raising what they know not to be points of order, that would itself be disorderly. And I know that the Honourable Gentleman of all people wouldn't want to stray into such misdemeanour. Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, just for the record, I've given way 6 times in this debate, and there's 6 days of debate, so we'll have plenty of time to make your points during the debate. But, Mr. Speaker, we will use every opportunity to vote down government policies that have failed to win public support. We will use every opportunity to win support for our programme. Labour is not merely an opposition, Mr. Speaker. We are a government in waiting with a policy programme. Mr. Speaker, with a policy programme that enthused and engaged millions of people in this election, many for the first time ever in their political lives. We are ready to offer real, strong and stable leadership in the interests of the many, not the few. We will test this government's Brexit strategy and what legislation comes forward against that standard. Mr. Speaker, this election engaged more people than for a generation, a tribute to our democracy. In the election, Labour set out a vision of what this country could be. What it could be. It could be more equal. It could be more prosperous. It could have opportunities for all. That is what we on this side will be putting forward in this Parliament. What we'll be fighting for in this Parliament. What we'll be demanding in this Parliament. The people of this country deserve something better than this thin piece of very little when they have so many problems they want and demand answers to from this Parliament. We will engage fully and make that case out for a prosperous, more stable, more cohesive society in Britain. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.